Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. So, interestingly, Andrew Klavan on his show today, July 1st, I think, um, continued on the discussion of some of the differences he's seeing between conservatives and liberals that he started yesterday, in which I made a video sort of in response to, but sort of continuing on this train of thought. And I want to do the same today because he basically was discussing a Gallup poll that came out recently that talked about Americans' view of the country and whether they were proud to be American or not. And basically, there was a deep divide between Democrats and Republicans, which was the way that they separated it out. And that Republicans were far more likely, I think like 70% or so, were extremely proud of being American. And I don't remember what the number for the Democrats was, but it must have been under 50%, because I think the overall average was around 50%. So he talked about how, conservatives or Republicans basically take pride in the structure of the country, the way that we function, the foundation that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence provide, the fact that we have peaceful elections and transfers of power, and that those are largely unique to the United States, especially for the length of time that we've done that, the length of time that we've been under the same Constitution and things along those lines. And that the Democrats were more proud when Democrats were in office. And he sort of linked it to this idea that, they were proud so long as their ideals and their way of thinking about what the government should be doing was in place, and that was the source of their pride. It wasn't sort of this, foundational element that was true for Republicans. And, I posted a note on, or comment on the video, and was thinking about how people on the left, by and large, seem to compare the country to a utopian version that they have in their minds of what the country could be. I think it differs, depending on who you talk to, but that seems to be a general sort of common thread. And so if you are going to compare what we have now to where we could be, then we are always going to fall short. And so then you aren't going to be super proud. And if you go farther back in history, then we're even farther away from where we could be. And I often hear, comments made that the Declaration or the Constitution were hypocritical documents, essentially, because some of the founders owned slaves, because we didn't live up to the sort of notions and ideals that were embedded in those documents. And so, I guess it's a different way that conservatives and liberals have of looking at the documents. They see, I think liberals view them as they were describing the way things ought to have been right then, as opposed to thinking about them as visionary documents, that these are the things that we are setting as a goal, and we are going to strive to live up to that. I mean, you have extremely lofty concepts in the document, the idea that all people are created equal, that we are going to provide, complete equality in terms of opportunity and freedom and protection under the law to everyone. I mean, that was so far from the case at the time that those documents were written that I don't know how you could realistically expect that that was going to be immediately put into place. And it reminds me, honestly, of corporate vision statements, or imagine most nonprofits have vision statements about what they want to achieve through the organization. And so maybe the United Way probably has a vision statement about solving poverty and sort of having every child in America be healthy. And so are they failing as an organization if they haven't achieved that yet? I don't think so. Obviously, they want to keep working until they do achieve it. But to suggest that the you shouldn't be proud of the organization, or you shouldn't be proud of the work that they're doing, or you should judge them as a failure because they haven't reached their ultimate goal, doesn't seem to make any sense to me. And it also seems to be a recipe for both disappointment and despair. And it actually got me to thinking about, whether this is connected to the high rates of depression that we see around the country. If large portions of the population are comparing themselves to the idea that they have in their mind of what they could possibly be, and if they're comparing, everyone around them and the groups that they're a part of, and the country as a whole to what it could possibly be, then who wouldn't be depressed about that? It's extremely hard to view those two, the current state and this, potential ideal at the same time and not feel upset at minimum. And if you don't have an idea of how we could possibly get there from, direct from point A to point B, then, I would imagine that's depressing for a lot of people. And actually, thinking back to my own history of working in nonprofit housing and working in low-income neighborhoods, and every day seeing trash-strewn and trash-filled lots and abandoned houses and hearing police sirens all the time, it was very upsetting. And without sort of a grounding in where we've come from and comparing it to something more, reasonable, for lack of a better word, it was very upsetting to constantly go into that environment, compare it to what I thought it could be or should be, and have to live with that discrepancy. And so I think one of the major differences with conservatives is that we compare things as they are to worse places in the world, places that don't allow you basic freedom of movement, basic political rights, basic ability to express yourself, opportunities to make a living in the way that you see fit. And there are more than enough of those that still exist on the planet now. And compare it to even where we ourselves have been, whether that's earlier in the sort of history of the country, whether that's even farther back before then when we were, still living, depending on who you are, the country that your ancestors came from and the situation that people were in, whether they were living under a monarchy, whether they were living under some sort of dictatorship. Even if you go back to England and Europe and places where the vast majority of people in the country were poor, and poor on a level that we can't even imagine today. One of the other things that Andrew Klavan pointed out is that the concept of poverty, which is just based on a percentage of sort of the median income, I think it is. If you're making below a certain percentage of X, then you're poor. Well, if X is high income, then 20% of that isn't actually all that bad. And especially compared to where people used to be, 90% of the country was probably making less than that. They had many fewer conveniences. People didn't have access to automobiles. People didn't have access to the internet. People didn't have access to mobile telephone, never mind any kind of communication device. There were basic health issues. There were, all kinds of things that were just common to the wealthiest of people. If you go and read the stories of the founding fathers and the process they went through of coming up with the Constitution. They were traveling in sort of hazardous conditions, dealing with all kinds of illnesses, having to be away from their families for months on end. Things that we just take for granted, they would have seen as miraculous at least. And so keeping that sort of grounding of comparing what you have to how bad it could be, as opposed to comparing what you have to how good it could be, is, in my opinion, way healthier for your own, mental health. And I am not saying that we shouldn't look forward, and I'm not saying we shouldn't have a sort of vision for utopia. I actually have thought many times over the past several years that it's very frustrating that so many of our movies and so many of popular stories that we have in the States are dystopian, that they are visions of horrible futures, that they are all about what could possibly go wrong, which doesn't actually help. It's good in a sense that you want to avoid failure, but if you want to have a focus for the future, you want to focus on where you want to get to so that you can take steps toward that. Whatever you are putting your sight on, that is where you are going to go. A friend once told me that when we were skiing together, that you want to make sure if you're skiing through the woods that you don't pay attention to the trees. You want to focus on the space in between them, because if you're focusing on the tree, you are going to hit the tree. So you want to focus on where you actually want to go. And it's incredibly sort of helpful in all areas of life that you want to keep in mind what your vision is for your future and to head in that direction. And so I would love to see more sort of, positive visions for the country, for the world. I think it would be interesting to see different people's versions of that. And back to some other videos I've made, I think that we would likely see very different versions, that people on the left would have a much more sort of authoritarian sort of, big government structure, that there would be these centralized, at least if not authoritarian, sort of organizations that would then ensure that everything was shared equally, whereas conservatives would have a much smaller centralized function, and that function would be to ensure that everyone was free to live their lives the way they wanted to, within certain bounds. Obviously, have agreement on basic things like you're not allowed to kill anyone, you're not allowed to physically attack them, you're not allowed to steal from people. That would be sort of the baseline framework, but then within that framework, people would generally be free to follow their own paths and to make their way and to become rich and then choose to share that with other people if that's what they're moved to do. And so it would be a really interesting exercise to have creative people on both sides of the political spectrum to lay out utopian visions, and to see how those differed. But again, I think it's, back to the original point of the video, it's extremely important to use that vision wisely, not to compare where you are in terms of a judgment to where you think you could be, because that's damaging to yourself and breeds depression and breeds a negative self-belief and self-image, but rather to use it as sort of your North Star, to use it as a focus for where you want to get to, and then to be considerate and thoughtful about, okay, if here's where I am and here's where I want to be, how can I get there? What are the steps that I need to take in order to get there? And you can only sort of engage in that exercise if you know where it is that you want to get to. And actually, Jordan Peterson has a ton of work around that topic and has sort of a whole series of exercises that you can do to define where it is you want to get to, and then sort of create those steps in order to get there. So I think we'll leave it there for today. It seems that Andrew Klavan is going to continue sort of this train of thought in over multiple series of videos. So maybe this will become a sort of call and response kind of scenario, and we'll see where that leads. Again, thanks for coming to the channel. Thanks for listening. If you have thoughts, criticisms, other ideas, anything in response to what I've shared, would love to see those in the comments. And if you want to make a video in response to what I've shared, that would be amazing. And look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks. Bye.